Good evening, everyone. My name is Ryan Marable, president of the National Pharmaceutical Association, and I thank you for joining us for this broadcast for the first installment of the National Pharmaceutical Association Black History Month celebration. Today, we bring to you an educational session titled Financial Fitness, Tips for Lifelong Financial Wellness for Pharmacists, presented by board certified financial planner, Mr. Kevin Henry of Oppenheimer Company Incorporated, based out of our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. This year, NAPHA has planned a slate of events during the month of February to celebrate Black history under the theme of Black health and wellness. As the oldest historically Black pharmacist association in America, our members remain committed to serving the needs of underserved communities nationwide. Just a quick housekeeping item before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the comment or chat space. We'll be sharing these with our speaker to discuss at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to screenshot, tweet, or share the messages learned during this presentation. And be sure to @ our social media handle, NAPHA Pharmacy, on all social media platforms. Now let's introduce our speaker. Mr. Kevin T. Henry is the Associate Director of Investments at Oppenheimer's Omega Group, overseeing portfolios of a select group of clients, including high net worth individuals and nonprofit institutions. Mr. Henry is a graduate of Howard University. Additionally, he earned his MBA from the University of Maryland. Now, when developing the framework for today's presentation, Mr. Henry and I elaborated on the importance of Black pharmacists and other medical professionals within the community, within he was raised. He and I discussed that pharmacists within Black communities often serve as first lines of health education and resources for their patients that they serve. Additionally, Black pharmacists often serve as economic pillars within their respective communities, often promoting an entrepreneurial spirit, scholarship, and real estate ownership amongst the people. He explained that as pharmacists and other Black health professionals pour unto others, he makes it his priority to fill up our cup with his financial expertise to ensure that we are able to continue to serve others and remain financially fit in the process. Now, in your best virtual spirit, please welcome Mr. Kevin Henry.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. That was a fantastic intro. And let me see here if I can start first and foremost by sharing my screen. Bear with me here. And I hope everyone is doing well tonight. Let's see here. All right, how is that? Is everyone able to see my screen? Is that displaying okay?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you. Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me, particularly you, Dr. Ryan. We've had, I'd say, some very good conversations. I don't know, I guess it was dating back to October around financial fitness and financial literacy, particularly in our community. So I'm really excited to be doing this today. Dr. Ryan, I think you gave a fantastic intro, so I won't belabor the point, but just, a few kind of a snapshot of who I am and where I come from. Originally from the Midwest, Indianapolis, Indiana, to be exact. As Dr. Ryan said, a Howard University grad, that's what brought me to the East Coast. I began my professional career at PNC Bank as an investment advisor, and kind of got my roots and got grounded there. Left PNC in 2014 to pursue my MBA at the University of Maryland. I am a certified financial planner, so a lot of what you hear me talk about today will be very financial planning centric, just as a heads up. These last 2 points might be the most important. I'll start with the last. I'm very much into cycling, particularly with the pandemic. I think that was one of the few things that kept me sane. I think we all kind of had a something that kept us sane throughout the pandemic. Love to be outside. And the big thing on my agenda, soon to be newlywed as of 9/9/22. So exciting stuff happening for me. But this fourth bullet is probably, or second to last bullet, is probably just as important. Really the reason, the premise, the thought behind doing this is really about, especially me being a minority and a financial planner, there aren't many that look like me, and really taking it upon myself to promote financial literacy, particularly within our communities. So that's a lot of today's conversation will be around that. Will be around financial literacy and promoting that message. So I guess I can kind of first start with what to expect from the next hour or so. And Ghaffar, if you could, I didn't introduce Ghaffar, but Ghaffar is my colleague. He's our quote unquote chief operations officer. So Ghaffar, if you could please help me stay on time and on track to make sure I don't spill over. But just kind of what to expect from the next hour or so. As you can probably tell by this comic, you should expect a bit of dry humor, right? That's just me. So this Dilbert comic is a bit of a preview of that. And Dr. Ryan, I'm going to ask you to chime in and laugh at some of my bad jokes. And if they're really bad, you can give me a thumbs down or whatever to keep me moving. But really, in all seriousness, my long-term objective, really for everyone on this call, relates to the first part of this comic, right? I want you to get to the point where you've saved enough money where you can retire anytime you want. And as you can see on this comic, it's a bit of an expletive, but let's call it FU money, right? In proper professional terms, that means that, you're striving to position yourself for a work optional lifestyle. I personally prefer FU money, right? So that's what we're trying to achieve today. And my only ask of you is really just to use me as a resource, right? Today will be presented as more of a, let's call it a checklist, or kind of a financial spring cleaning, right? So think of these items that we'll cover today as some of the most commonly encountered pitfalls, challenges, opportunities faced by people like yourselves, right? Folks who are comparatively higher earners, right? Who have busy careers, who have busy family lives, and most often pay a lot in taxes. I don't know about you, but I don't encounter too many folks who say that they're not paying enough in taxes, right? So that's who this is for. And the key adjective there was busy, right? If you're like me, or if you're like most of my clients, between work and family and kids and your spouse, there's barely ever 30 minutes just to sit down and enjoy a glass of wine, right? So I say to all of you, please use me as a resource. All of us have unique personal and financial lives in some way or another, which means that we all have specific concerns and challenges that we prioritize. So while I won't be able to cover specifics to each and every situation, feel free to call me, email me, text me, as long as it's within business hours. Don't get me in trouble with the fiance. But in seriousness, the little that I do know, I know very well. And for everything else, I'm very good with Google, and I'm very good at tapping the expertise of really some of the subject matter experts, in my network, whether it's around tax planning, legal planning, et cetera, right? So I do this for a living. Ghaffar does this for a living. We have the time to provide and or find the answers for you, right? So that's my intro. This is what I will try to cover today in our short time together. A wide range of material to cover in a short period of time. So I'll try to move through this very quickly, but please stop me for questions. I want this to be more of a dialogue as opposed to a monologue. But I think Dr. Ryan titled this conversation well, in kind of a fitness mindset. So for any of you who have ever worked with a personal trainer or have had some sort of fitness goals, right? You know that you first start by kind of goal setting, right? Whether it's, I want to run a marathon in 2022, or I want to lose 20 pounds before my wedding, right? You start with a goal. And then from there, you hire a personal trainer, which will be me for the next hour or so, or you work out by yourself, or you work out in classes. And usually what takes place in a best case scenario is that not in one workout, but over time, you hopefully get closer to that goal. So kind of think about this process today in that same fashion, where it's more or less a workout regimen that I'm putting together for you. All right, let's start with the basics, and I'll move to this very quickly because I know Dr. Ryan wanted us to cover more intermediate to advanced material, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least lay the foundation for you. So let's see what we've got here. All right, so I'm preaching to the choir, of course, but I think when we look to tackle any sort of challenge, it's I think important to first have a clear understanding of what that challenge entails and why it's a challenge. And I think from there, you can start to work on solutions. And a lot of today will be very solutions driven. So why is being a doctor, in this case, a pharmacist, hard financially? Part of it is that because you have an advanced education, that means you have fewer working years, right? You get started later with retirement savings. Most of us in our late 20s or early 30s. The second challenge, and I can attest to this as an MBA, and I'm sure a lot of attorneys can attest to this as well, is we typically graduate with higher student loan debt, right? So we're kind of starting from a negative net worth position. And I'll talk about that in just a few slides. This third bullet kind of, at least in my opinion, kind of goes unspoken. And that is, at least for those of you on the call, because you have those two letters DR in front of your name, there's some societal pressure, right? There's a belief that you should not only be taking care of yourselves and your family, but you should be taking care of those around you, right? Kind of that keeping up with the Joneses sort of thing. The fourth bullet I would say is a plus, and at least this is what I found, is that most doctors and most pharmacists are usually givers, right? You're involved with your community. You do the work that you do, not just for the income, but to give back and to empower the folks around you. And this last bullet I will harp on time and time again today is that you are busy, and I'm sure you all can attest to that. So those are some of the challenges. Let me move forward here to try to talk about some of the solutions. Okay, so here is step number one, in my opinion. Here's your starting point, right? And that's to kind of put pen to paper, so to speak, or really to, in this case, write out or type out where you are financially at this given moment. Really by, as you can see, let me see if I can use the pen tool here without blowing this up. Really by listing out all of your assets and all of your liabilities, right? Basically what you own and what you owe. And this is a very simple template. I pulled this from the Affinity Group, which is a group of advisors that specialize in working with medical professionals. More than happy to send this to you, to pass this along if you'd like to email me. But again, very straightforward, probably something you can put together yourself in 5 minutes. But in my opinion, really the simpler the better, because the key point is not just filling out this template, but it's about what you do with it after the fact. Okay. All right, so here are your action items, kind of what you do after you've created that net worth statement, because you can't just set it and forget it. So step number one, or the first thing that you should do, I would highly recommend that you update this net worth statement at least once every 12 months, at least annually, right? And just as important, I would also recommend that you update this net worth statement after every major life event, whether that is a new job, perhaps you bought into a new business or a new practice, perhaps you sold a business or a practice, marriage like myself, kids, any major life event, I would recommend that you go in and update this net worth statement, okay? And the second point, just as important, is that you should create some sort of goals around your net worth. And I think this next slide will give you a bit of guidance on how to set those goals. But, you know, like anything in life, it's about assessing your actual results versus your goals, right? And then at the end of the day, of course, you want to adjust your plan. And sometimes it's as simple as save more and spend less. So this requires a little bit of explaining. I'll try to touch on the key points here. I know I've had this question before is, okay, Kevin, look, how much should I be worth at age 40, at age 45, at age 50? And it's not an easy question to answer. It differs for each and every one. I pulled this from what I think is a really good resource. It's called the White Coat Investor Book, and I'll share that resource at the end of the presentation. It's by no means perfect, but I think it's a good measuring stick, if you will, as far as assessing your goals and doing some goal setting. So here's a very quick explanation as to what this is. So it starts with your annual salary, right? Multiplied by the years you've been in practice, which I think is really important for folks like yourselves, folks with advanced degrees. Most of these sorts of calculations you'll see will be based on your age. I prefer something that's based on years of practice or years out of residency. So you take years times years, salary times years in practice times 0.3 or 30%. Very easy math. And you subtract 200,000 to basically account for student loan debt. And that is how you arrive at your expected net worth. So based on this, and this is a hard and fast rule, at around 10 years out of residency, you should expect to be close to $1 million in net worth. At 20 years out of practice, a little more than 2 times that. And at age 30, you should be sitting pretty, right? Again, a nice back of the envelope. It doesn't fit for everyone, but at least a good starting point, a measuring stick, if you will. All right. Again, something that's very foundational, but I find it to be very valuable and a great starting point is understanding your cash flow, right? And it's basically cash in and cash out. Understanding which of your expenses are fixed expenses, like your mortgage, like your utilities, like your student loans, once those start back up again, like insurance, versus which are variable expenses. And then at the end of the day, making decisions around this disposable income, namely how much of that disposable income should go to saving, investing, and or paying off debt. Right, that's really your key decision. All right, so let me see something here. All right, so this is a bit of a facetious question, and that is, are you willing to live like a resident? All right, so look, by no means am I suggesting anyone go back to eating ramen noodles or drinking Kool-Aid or sleeping on an IKEA twin bed. However, I am suggesting that perhaps driving a 2004 Honda Civic versus a new Tesla Model X might be a financial sacrifice that gets you that much closer to retiring early or buying your own pharmaceutical practice or whatever your long-term goals might be, right? That's the key here. So I'll pause there for questions for a quick second before I move to the next section. Go to poll.
Also, if you all are able to see the poll at the bottom of your page, there's a quick poll that you can complete. That will give our speaker some insight based on some of the points that he's just made. Also, if you have any questions, please be sure to unmute yourself.
Great answers.
I have a quick question about the net worth sheet, the simplified version that you gave us as an example.
Yes.
Our house was listed as an asset. Should it go in that category if it's not paid off yet?
Great question. Yes. So at least the way that I look at real estate, it goes in two categories. The value of the real estate goes under what I call a real asset, and the mortgage goes under a liability. So you've got both, and the difference there will be the equity that you own in the real estate. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Welcome. So you got some great answers, Dr. Ryan. I'm surprised. Quite a few folks have taken the time to calculate their net worth this year.
I'm just glad that I didn't have to answer. Just gonna say that.
That's all right. I'm going to use you as a guinea pig a little bit later, so we'll put you on the spot. All right, cool, good. So yeah, so we had about a third that have calculated their net worth this year, and about 2/3 who are willing to live like a resident. But no ramen noodles. We're going to stay away from that. Okay. All right, cool. So I'll keep moving here. All right. So this is where I can get it. Here we go. All right, so here's where we get really into the meat and bones of the presentation. But let me start with this. Notice, I think this is a good disclaimer. Notice that this slide is not titled, I've seen so many books with these titles, How to Beat the Market or Making Millions Trading Stocks. That is not what I do. And I can say with confidence that most wealthy individuals, at least the ones that I know and work with, have not made their money by beating the market or trading stocks aggressively. Most have honestly built their wealth slowly and over time by saving consistently, investing prudently, and probably most important, avoiding mistakes. I know that's boring, but again, in my opinion, that kind of fast, sexy money tends to come fast and leave even faster, right? That boring money, if you will, it comes slowly, but it hangs around for an awfully long time. So I thought I would tee this up with that little comment. All right, so here we are. For those of you who want to know how to successfully plan for retirement, here it is. I solved it for you in 4 bullets. But really, there are really only 4, at least in my opinion, only 4 bullets or 4 variables that go into a successful retirement plan. And I'll go through each. And what you'll notice is that I will at least try to focus on these variables that are within your control more than anything else, and those that are most impactful. And I'll kind of give you a hint. Those that are most impactful, how much you save, and Father Time. All right, so let's start with the first variable. That is income. First thing to remember here is that your most valuable asset, it's not your 401k. Your most valuable asset is not your home. It's not even your pharmacy if you own your own practice. Your most valuable asset really is your knowledge. And it's your ability to convert that specialized knowledge into income. And your challenge is then converting that knowledge or earning potential, if you will, into long-term wealth, right? That might mean, again, delaying the purchase of your vacation home in the Caribbean or driving that Honda instead of the Tesla But we can go back to the same kind of adage that we heard from grandma. It's not how much you earn, it's how much you keep. Right, so that's the first variable. The second here is how much you save. And this one really is the key, in my opinion. And really about how much you save versus how much you earn. Kind of as a back of the envelope goal for all of you, as you go back and you calculate your net worth statement and you do your spending analysis, I would say a good back of the envelope goal for everyone is to look to save somewhere between 15 and 25% of your before tax income. Sometimes easier said than done, but that's a good back of the envelope number that will usually put you in a good position for the long term. Let me just really quickly walk you through this example around the impact of your savings rate. So again, I tried to start with someone who was kind of out of residency. So someone starting at age 31, they come out of residency earning $200,000 a year. They start off saving 10% of their income, and they earn a pretty, let's say, conservative return on their investments at 4%. That young woman or young man should be worth around $220,000 at age 40, right? Based on those factors. Take that same individual with that same savings rate that invest more aggressively at 8%. And just to kind of put this into perspective, the stock market averaged about, let's call it 9.9, 10% from 1990 to 2021. So this is primarily a stock portfolio, which makes sense for someone who's 31. Their net worth at age 40 is a little shy of $270,000. So better, $50,000 more just by investing more aggressively. Now taking a look at the last row, same age, same income. Now we're saving just a little bit more. So what is this? Saving $30,000 as opposed to $20,000. We're back to investing very conservatively at 40%. I'm sorry, at 4%. Yet and still, the net worth at age 40 is significantly higher at $330,000. So again, I can't emphasize enough the real variable that drives your retirement planning, particularly if you're in your 40s and 50s, is this savings rate. It starts to flip when you get into your 60s, but in your 40s and 50s, this really is the key driver. All right. So variable number 2, and let me kind of position this way, and at least in my opinion, there are really only 3 ways and 3 ways only to make money as an investor, right? The first is the most difficult, right? That is timing the market, right? That's knowing when a stock, or really any investment for that matter, is selling at a low price relative to its future value. The problem is that I've yet to meet anyone who has a crystal ball and who can consistently and accurately predict when an investment's price or predict what an investment's price will be in the next 1 year, 2 years, etc. Right? Most of us, even those of us who are in the profession, Gafar can attest, most of us can't predict what a stock is going to trade at the next day, right? So timing is extremely difficult. The second way is not quite as difficult, but difficult nonetheless, and that is security selection, AKA stock picking. Right? Again, extremely difficult, takes a lot of work, time, more than anything else. The third is what I'll focus on. This is the much easier method, in my opinion, to generate at least positive returns over the long term. And that is spending your precious time on not necessarily whether Apple will outperform Amazon, but instead focusing on, I always say, the forest versus the trees. That is with the help of a financial planner or even a software program, honestly, or simply by doing your own research. I would suggest that you start by creating an asset allocation plan. And basically what that means is that is how much of your overall assets should be invested in stocks versus bonds versus cash. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Something to mention, particularly for this audience and for our communities, is that the statistics say pretty obviously and consistently that we as African Americans tend to put more of our investment dollars into real estate, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but as we're doing our asset allocation plan, we should take that into account as we're kind of looking at or trying to understand how our financial pie is divided, so to speak, right? And looking at it by percentage. So key takeaway here, I would say start by creating or revising or updating your asset allocation plan first before you become, or at least consider becoming a stock picker or a market timer. All right. So I hope you all will forgive my kindergarten style drawing here. This is my favorite diagram from the slide deck. I debated putting a professional looking chart on this page, but I decided against it simply because, at least in my experience, I have seen these charts a million times, and I think far too often they're a bit unrealistic. To put it honestly, you've probably heard this spiel from a financial person or an insurance salesman at some point, is that, okay, if you start investing at age 20, and you invest $10,000 and you make 12% a year on your investment, through the magic of compounding, that mere $10,000 can grow to 3 million by the time you're 70. Well, at least in my opinion, here's the problem with that illustration. I don't know about you, but saving consistently, particularly in my 20s and particularly in my early 20s, was a struggle for a number of reasons. Number one, because I didn't make much money. And number two, because my disposable income frequently went towards a good time as opposed to retirement savings, right? That's just me being honest. So the takeaway here is take time to create a plan, either software, whether it's a Vanguard or Fidelity. There are a million programs online that come at either low to no cost, or take time to create an asset allocation plan that's specific to you, right? The reality is that most of us won't average returns of 12% a year. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to need to work until age 70. You know, I very much enjoy what I do, but in my 60s, or really my 50s for that matter, I want work to be more optional than mandatory. All right, that's just me. So Dr. Ryan, should I pause for questions there before I move to investment planning?
Yes, absolutely. I think this will be a great time for questions. If you have any questions, please unmute yourself. Please share those with our speaker. Also, there will be a poll shared here in just a moment.
So one of the questions that I had was when we were talking about the savings. Was it savings like a savings account, like a bank savings account, or are you talking about savings as a requirement from your employer?
Dr. Helen, I think I heard bits and pieces. I think you asked, should you be saving in a bank account or an employer retirement account? Is that right?
Yeah, I was asking it, like when you're talking about savings, are you talking about, I go and open a savings account through my bank that may or may not have a high return, or are you talking about specifically through your employer savings account or through like a Fidelity savings account, retirement account, I mean?
Yes, good question. Now I'll have a checklist on that in just a bit, but that was more specifically around retirement savings and investment savings, not necessarily a bank account. You usually, in what you'll see in I think just a few slides, is kind of a priority list of where to save first at least. So you always want to start with establishing that emergency savings, if you will, and that's typically a bank account. But after that, especially when it comes to retirement planning and investment planning, it's going to be more aligned with accounts and account types that are positioned for longer term growth, which bank accounts typically aren't.
Thank you.
Welcome. Playing variable, most important. Okay, good question.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you mentioned the pie. So I really would like for you to address in your retirement age,
Yes.
when it comes to your pie, how much should be in bonds, how much should be in stocks, and how much should be cash? What percent, the percentages?
That is a difficult question to answer. And the reason it is, and the answer is it depends. But it really depends on your own individual situation. I can say, generally speaking, as you get closer to retirement, more of your pie should be invested in more conservative investments like bonds, like real estate. But that's generally speaking. There are some folks that I work with, God bless them, who are in their 70s and still working and have most of their assets in stocks. So very, very specific to the individual, but generally speaking, as you start to draw on your assets, you want them more allocated to conservative investments, if that answers the question.
And that's what I was thinking as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Very welcome. All right.
All right, thank you everyone who participated in this poll. We will turn the floor back over to our speaker.
All right, so that was retirement planning solved in 4 variables. This is somewhat similar, a tad more granular, so bear with me here. This is investment planning solved in 5 variables. And what I will cover here, I'll cover risk, diversification, expenses, because again, that goes back to that earlier slide. It's not what you make, it's what you keep. Taxes, obviously nothing is certain, but death and taxes. And that last bullet is in all caps, very intentionally. Your behavior makes a heck of a lot of difference in the success or lack thereof of your investment planning. So let me try to touch on these quickly for you. See if I can. There we go. All right. So outside of behavior, I would say that this is the variable that is the most important, and that's risk, right? And at least the way that I think about it, risk comes in 2 forms, right? And it's really, it's important to understand the difference between the 2. You know, one form is art, one is science, you know, one is intellectual, one is emotional. But let's start with quantitative risk, because I think that's the easiest. And that is, at least the way that we as investment professionals define it, that's the amount of risk that you can afford to take, taking into account your time horizon or the length of time you're able to invest, taking into account your income, your other assets, et cetera, et cetera. Fairly easy to calculate with a software program. The more important type of risk is the second one, and that's qualitative risk. That is how much risk you're comfortable with, or maybe better put, how you feel about risk. And I can tell you firsthand experience, after doing this for about a decade and a half, advising people on everything money related, that emotions and feelings are perhaps the greatest enemy to successful investing. Okay, let that sink in a little bit. Now, let me be realistic. How you feel about risk can't be ignored, right? I can't fault anyone, for instance, being worried about their money and their investments during the financial crisis, right? Or more recently, someone being worried about their finances during the start of the COVID pandemic, right? So Dr. Ryan, here's where I'll use you as a guinea pig, just to kind of put risk into perspective. Let's say Dr. Ryan invested $1 million with me at the beginning of 2020, January 2020. Dr. Ryan invested $1 million with me. by, let's call it February 2020, we know that the COVID pandemic really started to spike. Fast forward about 4 weeks to March 2020, Dr. Ryan would have lost on paper a little over $300,000. That's over the span of about 4 weeks. That hurts. I'm sure Dr. Ryan would have cursed me out and called me all sorts of names. But let's say he was patient enough to, I see the sad face. Let's say he was patient enough to stay invested. By that summer, let's call it June, May, June, Dr. Ryan would have fully recouped his losses, right? And add to that, if you were to fast forward to today, Dr. Ryan's $1 million portfolio would be worth somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's call it $1.5, $1.6 million, right? That's even after the market selling off going into 2022. So now he has the happy face, right? So the takeaway here is to understand when you're being emotional versus rational with your money and your investments. And look, I get it. If you don't have that sort of self-discipline, let's call it, or, I would say to consider having let's call it a financial referee, right? And it doesn't have to be a financial planner. It can be your mother-in-law or your father-in-law if you have that sort of relationship. But someone who can serve as a buffer if you have an emotional breakdown and want to sell all of your investments and stash the money under your mattress. Please don't do that. All right, so that's my 2 cents on risk. Let's dive a little bit more into the quantitative side of risk. I think this is important for you all. So I'm going to try not to bore you to sleep, but I'm going to take you back just for a minute or two to your college stats class, right? I talked a lot about the emotional side of investing. This is the science of risk, right? This is the intellectual side. So when it comes to measuring risk in your investment portfolios, there are really 2 ways to do it. And I would suggest doing both. The first, let's see if we can get there. Whoops, first is here. First is standard deviation. And you probably all are familiar with the term, given your profession. But just to give my basic definition as it relates to investments, I think about standard deviation as the expected range of returns by magnitude for any given investment, right? As you can imagine, the higher the standard deviation, the more volatile or the riskier an investment could be perceived, and vice versa, right? For instance, I couldn't pull up a chart, but let's take Bitcoin as an example. We would all expect Bitcoin to have a high standard deviation. On any given day, Bitcoin can be up 10% or down 10%, right? Versus bonds were brought up earlier. Those typically have a smaller standard deviation. So that's one way from a quantitative perspective to look at risk in your portfolios. I also, or let me say this, the flaw or the problem with standard deviation as a risk metric is that it measures both upside and downside risk. And I don't know about you, but I'm perfectly fine with a high standard deviation if the investment only deviates to the upside. I mean, in reality, that's a rare occurrence, but nonetheless, a way to kind of isolate downside risk or risk of losses, we can utilize a measure called maximum drawdown. And I know this is kind of tough to see, so I'll just try to call out the numbers for you, and we'll go back to using Dr. Ryan as an example. So what we've done here, we've looked at historical data. We're going back to 2001 up to 2020. Let's call this Dr. Ryan's portfolio. And he wants to know, Dr. Ryan and his wife want to know, what's the worst case scenario for this portfolio that you proposed for me? And I would say to him, well, the worst case would have been during the financial crisis, right? At the very worst, your $1 million portfolio would have been down $240,000 and some change, right? Your portfolio would have started to decline in January of 2008 and would have stopped declining in March of 2009. And by 2010, a little more than 2 years later, you would have recovered all of your losses, right? So that's how you read this. Just to contrast that with the S&P 500, which is basically how we look at the stock market. The stock market would have been down about nearly 50% over that time frame, and it would have taken from 2007 to 2012, almost 5 years, to recover all of your losses. So again, just another way to look at and assess risk, and really asking yourself, are you comfortable with that? Obviously, the financial crisis was an anomaly, but still something that we need to take into account. All right. So here's some practical advice for you. And I would say this is particularly important for our married couples in the audience. Be mindful that men and women typically think about risk differently. And look, the bottom line is that we all have different relationships or experiences with money, and that colors our opinion. So just a piece of practical advice. If you manage your household assets together, right? I would say have long, detailed conversations around how you both think about risk. And again, a good way to maintain a happy home and a happy marriage is to have someone serve as that referee or that go-between, right? Someone who is going to be objective and even play bad cop when needed, right? I just had this come up with one of my clients that she's told her husband at least 20 times to go see the attorney to get their will updated. Well, let your financial referee get on your husband or your wife's case to get that done. So this is a piece of practical advice. All right, moving on to diversification. Comes in two forms again. I'll try to cover these quickly. Diversification by asset class and diversification by security, AKA by stock, bond, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so we'll start here. You were probably all wondering, what the heck am I looking at? On its surface, I know it's a bunch of colors and numbers. On its surface, it may seem a bit complicated, and investment people love this chart for some reason. But the message is really simple, and that is, back to grandma, don't put all of your eggs in one basket, right? And this is kind of taking you again back to your college stats class. What you're really looking at here is to have complementary investments. That is, if one investment's going down, you have something else that's going up. So just to give you an idea of what you're looking at here, as far as diversification by asset class, someone asked earlier about the mix of stocks, bonds, and cash that you should have in your portfolio. This is just to give you a feel for how these different assets perform in different environments. So let's go back to the financial crisis. One of the worst years we've ever seen in the investment world. You can see the best performing assets were the boring assets: bonds, that's fixed income, and cash, which is almost never the best performing asset, right? The worst performers were the riskiest, emerging market equities. So those are stocks in primarily India, China, Brazil, etc. Now you can see that very next year, and again, the market kind of swings back and forth like a pendulum. Emerging market stocks were the worst performer in 2008. Take a look at 2009. Now they're the best performer, up 80%, right? And just as another example that's more recent, looking at the start of the COVID pandemic in 2020, you can see that small cap stocks, which are not necessarily mom and pop businesses, but much smaller than, say, an Apple or an Amazon, those were the best performer. And look at the worst performer was real estate. And you probably all can guess why. Think about shopping malls. I don't know about you, but I didn't go to a shopping mall once during 2020. Think about office space, a lot of which went unoccupied, or leases didn't get renewed during 2020. So again, just making the point that it always makes sense to be diversified and to not put all of your eggs in one basket. All right, so here's kind of a second point to that. And again, let me kind of start with some practical advice. I would say for most of you on the call, for the majority of you, your best method to manage risk and really to generate strong long-term returns is not through security selection or stock picking, right? Because it requires you dedicating a heck of a lot of time to research, to analysis, to selecting the individual stocks. And I say that not because you don't have the mental acumen. I mean, for goodness sake, you all survived pharmacy school. I wouldn't have stood a chance. It's really because the majority of you don't have the adequate time to dedicate to stock selection. And I'll reiterate a point I made on, I think on slide 19, is that most successful investors create long-term wealth through kind of careful, thoughtful asset allocation over stock selection. So again, this goes back to looking at complementary investments. For all of you who are unfamiliar with correlation, this is looking at US large stocks. So let's say Apple as an example, and what sort of investments complement US large stocks? Well, if you have a correlation of 1, that means your asset moves in lockstep, meaning you have no correlation or a complete lack of diversification. If you're -1, that means you move in inverse, and 0 means there's no correlation. So you're looking for assets that are complementary that have either low correlation or negative correlation. For instance, boring bonds have a negative correlation to stocks, as does currency, right? So again, here, just to give you a snippet of some of the things that we look at when we're trying to put together complementary investments. Okay, again, I'll give you a fair warning here. A lot of numbers on one slide. I'm not going to go line by line, I promise. And I do not recommend any of you dedicate any significant time to this exercise. But I did kind of want to give you a peek behind the curtain, if you will, just to show you a few methods that investment professionals use to determine the value of a security. For instance, in this case, we're looking at the value of Google, right? So again, not a process that I think you need to know how to do, but I do think it's important to know how to interpret this, or at least what goes into it. And the most important thing to know, at least conceptually, is that any asset, whether it's investment real estate property or it's a share of Google, is really only worth the potential income or earnings that it's able to generate. So with that in mind, what this analysis attempts to do is to forecast into the future. And I think you can see that here. We're looking at only 2 years, 2022 and 2023. We're trying to forecast into the future what the earnings might be for Google. And then we translate those earnings to the present day through a process called discounting, right? Which simply means that we're reducing those earnings by time and by interest rates. And for those of you who have been paying attention to the financial news, I'm sure you've heard lots of talk around rising interest rates and their impact on particularly highly valued stocks like Tesla or Netflix. And the reason these types of companies kind of suffer more than, say, a Walmart is that Tesla's future earnings are expected to be much higher than its present day earnings, right? So when you put together an analysis like this, it makes those future earnings worth a heck of a lot less, right? So it goes back again, I'll boil it down to an old adage, is that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. That's in essence what this is trying to interpret. Okay, I showed an earlier slide and this goes back to that about it's not what you make, it's what you keep. And I would say that same general principle applies to investing, and namely 2 sources of expenses to be aware of, both internal and external. And I'll just touch on those very briefly here. So the first layer of expenses, of investment expenses, is the actual transaction cost, right? And in almost any and every transaction, there will be intermediaries that facilitate a transaction, whether you're buying a car and you're going to a dealership, or whether we buy or sell a house and we work through a realtor, right? There's typically some sort of intermediary in that transaction. And when it comes to stocks, that transactional cost is called a commission, right? Typically charged when you both buy or sell a stock. Now, the good news, thanks to technology, is that most online brokerages, like a Schwab or a Fidelity, not giving them a shout out, but just as examples, allow you to buy or sell stocks at really little or no commission. So I would suggest that if you are determined to be a do-it-yourselfer and you really enjoy stock picking, then an online brokerage should work just fine for you. They're fantastic at facilitating that transaction at a very low cost. Now, for the many more of you who aren't stock pickers, are really just those of you who have retirement plans like 401ks or 403bs, then you are familiar with mutual funds, right? Which is, in essence, a way to own multiple stocks or bonds without having to buy them individually. And again, there are costs to be aware of, as you can probably imagine. The equivalent to a commission for a mutual fund is what's called a load, right? Now, these were very prevalent in the 90s and 2000s, but I would say have since either largely diminished or disappeared as far as an investment cost with mutual funds, but still something to be aware of. Now, a cost or an expense that you will almost always encounter is what's called an expense ratio, right? So this really applies to any mutual fund or ETF, which for those of you who aren't familiar, that's the acronym for an exchange traded fund, which I think of as like the sister to a mutual fund. But there's always a cost to participate in the investment, whether it's high or low or somewhere in between. And what you're basically paying for is a portion of the technology, the salary for the portfolio managers, the researchers, et cetera, that these funds or ETFs employ, right? And the expense ratio for any fund or ETF can vary pretty dramatically. Just a word of caution, because I've seen too many people fall into this trap. Please don't make an investment choice simply based on the cost of a fund or an ETF. You know, I think you all know that cheaper does not equate to better, right? I think one of my former colleagues would say almost on a daily basis, and it got a little annoying, that there's no free lunch in America, right? You typically get what you pay for, and I would say the same holds true for investing for the most part. Last but not least, I would be remiss if I didn't highlight the fact that I cost money, as do other financial planners or investment advisors. So if and when you are considering hiring a financial planner or an advisor, make sure you know what they cost and how they're compensated, right? Typically, investment professionals either charge an hourly fee for service, which is becoming less common unless they're doing financial planning only, but most charge a percentage fee based on the dollar value of assets that they're managing or that you place under their care, right? So again, let's go back to using Dr. Ryan as an example. If he asked me to manage a $500,000 portfolio, $500,000 portfolio, I might quote him a 1% fee, right? So that's $5,000 a year. That's nothing to sneeze at. So, you know, you can trust and believe that Dr. Ryan is going to have me thoroughly explain in great detail what he gets for his money, right? So again, something else to be aware of as far as expenses are concerned. All right, taxes. Nothing is certain but death and taxes. So honestly, I could do an entire class on taxes and investing, but we'll save that hopefully for another time. But just 2 data points that I wanted you all to know, that I wanted to hit on. The first is turnover. So that refers to the frequency or how often a fund manager buys and sells the investments it owns. Why does that matter to you? Is because every time an investment advisor makes a transaction, buys or sells an investment, that potentially means either a reduction in taxes for you, or more often than not, it could mean that you owe taxes, potentially. The more important event is the second bullet, and that is capital gains distributions. So this is the event that's the trigger event for the IRS. This means that money has left the fund or the ETF and has been distributed to you as cash. Even if it stays in the account, when it leaves the fund, that's a capital gains distribution. So again, something to be aware of. And I'll leave you with the last, and I would say perhaps the most important variable, and that is your own behavior, right? I talked about emotions and feelings being an enemy to good investing. They can also be a positive. If you're someone who's self-disciplined, or if you make the decision to hire that financial referee, your behavior can be alpha or additive to your investing. But it's really just about knowing yourself, understanding who you are as a person and how you react to money, really, and your own experience with money. So with that, Dr. Ryan, should I pause for questions again before I start to wrap up?
I think we can open, if anyone has any questions, please unmute yourself at this time.
Hey, Kevin, this is Gafar. There was a couple of questions in the chat line. One of the questions from Cindy is your business a fiduciary? Maybe you want to just touch on that.
Yeah, thank you, Gafar. Yes, so we are fiduciaries. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, a fiduciary, and thankfully this term has received quite a bit of publicity over the past few years. A fiduciary is someone who is charged with acting in your best interest, acting in the client's best interest. That comes, just to give you an example, if there are 2 different funds that meet your investment needs, as a fiduciary, I would always prioritize the fund that is a better cost to you, the investor. Whereas some of you probably remember in the 90s and 2000s, most advisors acted as brokers, meaning they were simply charged with completing a transaction on your behalf. So yes, we do act as fiduciaries, Cindy. Thank you for that question.
And another question is, what accounts are positioned for longer term growth?
I would say that that's a great tee up to this next slide. Your accounts that are best positioned for longer term growth are those that meet these 2 words, that are tax advantaged. Those are the accounts that you want to focus on for long-term growth. So that would be your 401k, your 403b, IRAs, even a health savings account. Those are all account types that have a special tax advantage per the IRS and per the government. But really, it goes kind of those tax advantaged accounts. It goes kind of your plain vanilla individual investment accounts, and your bank accounts are kind of last emergency fund sort of money.
All right, I think there's one more. I mean, if you can take it.
Sure.
Can you give some examples of high interest saving accounts?
It is, with our low rate environment, it is awfully difficult to find high interest savings accounts these days. A high interest savings account these days, maybe 2%. which isn't much. It's not even keeping up with inflation. But some banks will offer, especially credit unions. If you all have access to a credit union, you will typically find more advantageous interest rates, both when you're saving and borrowing from a credit union than you would from, again, not to call anybody out, like a big bank like a Chase or someone like that, or a Bank of America. So. Did that answer it, Gafar?
Yes.
Okay. Alrighty. All right. So let me start to wrap up with your, I'm kind of sticking with the, well, I'm pivoting a little bit from fitness to football. And Dr. Ryan, I got to give you a shout out. I think I gave you good luck with the Bengals in the Super Bowl. I'm taking credit for that. So let me wrap up with start to wrap up with a playbook. And it's two-part. And again, I am more than happy to send this to anyone. And I know Dr. Ryan is recording this. But I would say this is your big picture investing playbook. 5 steps. I tried to keep it simple. All right, whoops. All right. And we talked about this early on. The first is really just to determine your goals, right? Whether it's retiring at 55, or you want to save money for your children's education, or you want to buy a vacation home, or you want to buy investment property, or you want to buy a practice. It starts with these goals. I can't emphasize that enough. The second step is to choose which type of accounts that you'll save in. I mentioned a little earlier about, with Gafar's question, about those tax advantaged accounts. That's typically where you'll want to start. And I'll elaborate on that on the next slide. The third step is to focus more on that asset allocation plan. That is, what will be your mix of stocks, bonds, cash that's likely to meet your goals. And from there, we love using this analogy, the buckets. That fourth step is to select the investment vehicles that are going to fill each bucket. Again, you're taking into account risk, return, cost. And this fifth step, outside of goals, is probably the most important. I would suggest that you don't simply set it and forget it, but that you at least, similar to your net worth statement, is to revisit your investments at least on an annual basis, just to see where you are. I mean, if you've owned a good deal of stocks over the past 2 years, you know, they've probably almost doubled over that time frame. So good to go back and rebalance your portfolios based on your own individual goals. All right, so this is kind of your more granular step-by-step playbook. All right, so and I've got this kind of divided into 3-part priorities. Kind of starting from the easiest low-hanging fruit to the more granular. The first is easy. I would suggest that you first get your match. You know, if you're fortunate enough to have an employer that provides a match, start there, get the match. The second would be, and I don't always agree with this order, but at least a starting point, I would suggest that you look at paying off high interest debt, particularly debt that's in the double digits. I would assume that would be more credit cards. The third step, I talked about those tax advantaged accounts. I would suggest that you max out your retirement plan if you can afford to do so. And this is a bit of a blanket statement, but I would say that if you're making comfortably in the 6 figures, that you should strongly consider maxing out your retirement plan. That's around $20,000 that you can put into that plan every year that gets tax deferred and reduces your taxable income. That's low-hanging fruit. Fourth step is to maximize IRAs for both you and your spouse. If it makes sense to fund a health savings account, again, because that's tax advantaged. If you have children, I would consider a 529 plan. All right. If it makes sense, then you can start to think about paying off lower interest debt and saving and investing in taxable investment accounts. This is kind of an optional step. I'm not necessarily a fan of paying off mortgages early. That's an entirely different conversation. But glad to have that for anyone who has questions. And let's not forget spending on what makes you happy. All right, so that's the general playbook. And I'm going to skip ahead for the sake of time. Let's see here. So I did want to give you all a few resources for those of you who want more information. A lot of this, full disclosure, a lot of the information that I pulled today was from this particular book, which I found to be a fantastic read. It's a little over 100 pages. It's written by an emergency physician, plain English, actionable steps, inexpensive book, highly recommend it. And of course, I'm always going to recommend the guy in front of you. Of course, feel free to call, email me, text me, whatever. And I'll leave you with a little nugget of wisdom, is that wealth is not what you accumulate, it's not what you spend. It's seldom luck or inheritance or advanced degrees or even intelligence that enables people to amass fortunes. Wealth is more often a result of a lifestyle of hard work, perseverance, planning, I love that word, and most of all, self-discipline. And of course, I had to leave you with a Dilbert comic. And here, for anyone who has additional questions, would like more information, would like to sign up for our e-newsletter, feel free to reach out to me here. I'm extremely accessible. And again, to the conversation I had with Dr. Ryan, I am extremely passionate, adamant about promoting financial literacy, particularly within our communities. It is not done nearly enough. We have a long ways to go, but I think it starts with conversations like this. And with that, Dr. Ryan, I will stop talking and open it up for questions, comments, etc.
Excellent. Excellent. So first and foremost, on behalf of the National Pharmaceutical Association, Board of Directors, our nationwide member network, and our affiliates with the NAPHA Foundation and the Student National Pharmaceutical Association, I want to express our sincere gratitude for your presentation today. Please expect a token of our appreciation for your time and expertise. So at this time, we will open up the floor for question and answer. If you do have a question, please unmute yourself. I can lead us off if we don't have any questions, but just considering our organization being a volunteer service organization for underrepresented and underserved communities,
Yeah.
how can us as pharmacists promote being financially fit toward those who we serve? Because I feel like that's an important, because we do get to interface with patients
Yes.
pretty much on a daily basis. So how could you recommend us to continue to pour those into our people we serve?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question and right on time. Honestly, I think a lot of it just starts with conversations, with family, friends, colleagues, patients, around financial literacy and money. I've had quite a few of these conversations, particularly with, folks that are baby boomers, and they time and time again express the fact that they just didn't have these conversations in their household. Right? This was money was kind of a taboo topic. They were told to go to school, get a good degree, become a doctor or a lawyer, and the rest takes care of itself. But it doesn't work that way. So I think the easy answer, Dr. Ryan, is just starting to have these conversations, and us not just keeping this information to ourselves, but sharing this with our respective communities.
Thank you.
Welcome.
If we have any additional questions, please unmute yourself at this time. All right, and seeing none, I thank everyone for joining us this evening. Be sure to stay tuned for more Black History Month events brought to you by NAPHA. Visit our website at www.mpha.net or visit us on our social media pages at NAPHA Pharmacy on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our official YouTube page, to which this will be broadcasted later on next week. Again, I thank you to our speaker, Mr. Kevin Henry, and to all of our audience for your attention and participation this evening. Everyone, have a great night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.